Catherine Liddle, welcome to the programme.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Now, just in reference to those two events, the alleged attempted terrorist attack on a group of Indigenous people, large group of Indigenous people in Western Australia, and neo-Nazis attacking a sacred Indigenous location in Victoria, is racism against Indigenous people changing or evolving in Australia?
Look, I think that that's what we heard coming through from the inquiry. People, they turned up to tell stories that were quite harrowing, and three things were really, really obvious. One was that it was pervasive and that it was at a level that should not be tolerated. They talked about incidences not only that hit the media like the ones that were just described, and let's be clear, we're talking about an allegation that an explosive device was thrown into a family day. The NAIDOC marches are a family day. That's who that was aimed at. And the other one, again, just mobs sitting down. That's what they do in Victoria at that particular spot. They sit down and they're not causing any trouble or anything like that. They're just sitting down. So it's a really powerful statement of what it means to be Aboriginal. But what they were saying is that those things are becoming more pervasive. They're feeling it at an individual level. They're hearing it from their children. They're hearing it from their communities, and it is absolutely intolerable. And they're saying the second part of that is that it's changed. The narrative has changed. Social media has even changed the way media is responding to incidences of racism and perpetuating sometimes the language. We heard a lot about the language effectively being coded so that it wasn't being picked up by moderators, but effectively what it was doing was impacting the story. So what you'd hear was a misrepresentation about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. What you'd hear was a framing of a story that would be picked up and amplified, and that those things were stirring up community. And the third thing we were really hearing very clearly was accountability. All of those people that stood up and told those stories were saying, we've got to get better at this. We can't accept it. We have to have accountability. And how can we be accountable if we even had governments that didn't bother to turn up and listen?
I'll come to that in a moment, but just on the question of the inquiry and what you hope it can achieve, of course, we know there have been literally hundreds of inquiries that have included questions about the impact of racism on Indigenous people in Australia over decades. What can another inquiry hope to achieve?
Look, I think this one is really hopeful that what we're going to see is a level of accountability, and that is we can't allow these things to continue to be perpetuated. One of the things that was really obvious, and we heard it in so many submissions, was it saying a lot of this is being modelled at the top. So it is a narrative that's often perpetuated by politics because it makes people angry and they grab onto it and it becomes public fodder. There has to be a level of accountability in that. But there also has to be a move to go, well, we can't just blame the social media giants. We have to have consequences as a result of not coding properly, of not picking these things up, of not having Aboriginal moderators in there to actually hear the stories. And then we've got to make sure that we follow through with actions. But most importantly, what we can't do is just let another inquiry slip through. Now, the consequences, and again, a really practical example of what that pylon can look like. We know that on the weekend there was an alleged assault that involved a car chasing two young children in Mildura, two 12-year-olds. Let's be really clear on that, two 12-year-olds. Now, one of those children was really badly harmed in that incident, and instead of the community online leaning in and going, my goodness, this is horrific, imagine the fear, imagine the distress, we want this child to be well, what we saw was a pylon. These children deserved it. These children were guilty just by the fact that they were Aboriginal. Turns out none of that was true. They were just kids in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is terrifying, and again, that narrative was not stopped by social media. That means accountability from the top all the way through to the individual who says, hang on, something's wrong with that story.
Can you just explain what you mean by accountability? You're talking about social media, but you're also talking about culture and politics.
Look,
when you say you want accountability to come out of this inquiry, what does that mean?
Look, words matter, and we heard that a lot. We heard that the narrative that is often used, particularly around times of elections, stirs up a lot of these emotions, stirs up a false narrative, gets people to pile on, and that we heard that a lot, piling on. So we need accountability to that. If we know that your words matter, and even if they're contained within social media, and we've got those laws that say, you know, children can't be exposed to it, what we're also seeing from the evidence coming through on that is, in actual fact, it doesn't stay isolated in that. And again, the incident in Mildura shows how horrific the impact of that sort of thing can be. So it's saying, listen, at the system, at the political level, we need politicians to be more aware of the language that they use and the narrative that they drive. At the system level, we need our organisations that are supposed to be caring for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about government services in particular, to actually step up and recognise when, instead of helping people, they are harming people. We need that front and centre. We need redesign on those sorts of services. We also need that other narrative at the grassroots level that says, as an individual, what sort of country do I want to live in? Do I want to live in a country that thinks this is okay, that it thinks that these incidences that people were describing are tolerable? I don't think so. What sort of country do we want our children to grow up in, and what sort of experiences do we want our children to have? So when we're talking about accountability, it's always good to go back to children.
You mentioned before that not all, that many of the state representatives did not come to the inquiry, including the Northern Territory government, which obviously has the highest per capita number of Indigenous people in Australia. Their argument for that was they did not think the inquiry would have any practical outcomes. They didn't want to participate in another inquiry. What's your response to that?
Look, I mean, that one's really simple. How can you respond to what people are experiencing if you're not even prepared to listen to it? That's really simple. How can you show any responsibility to your constituents if you're not even willing to sit into the room while they step up and tell a story? And I don't know if how many people have ever gone into a public inquiry, but it's really quite scary. It is scary to sit in those rooms. It affects you physically, emotionally and psychologically. And those people stood up and they said, we want to tell you a story because we want this to stop. And if we're looking for accountability, it starts at the top. Show up.
Catherine Liddle, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.